Hello everyone, this is Francesca Lievi and I will be together with you for some of the lectures of this course on food sustainability. I have a background in environmental and land planning engineering and last year I got my PhD in geography. My thesis was dealing with the problem of meat consumption and how meat consumption has evolved in the last 60 years around the world, and also what is happening on the policy side when it comes to food sustainability and the account of meat in that sector. Alongside with my PhD, I've also been involved in other projects. So I've been able to gather a set of different experiences, and I hope they're going to be useful also in the context of this course. The first lecture we have today is about food and sustainable development goals. And I thought that it would be important to start with this framework because I think it really sets the way to understand how important is food for all other parts of society as well. So in this lecture, I would like to start with some history and basic information on Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, and then an overall description of these goals and their specific aims. And then we will go a bit deeper in the connections and interlinkages between food and sustainable development goals. And in the end, I also want to present some examples for you for how youth can really help to achieve sustainable development goals. So in 1972, there was the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. And this is the first time that United Nations started to talk about sustainable development. 9 years later, so 1983, there was the World Commission on Environment and Development, where the first formal definition of sustainable development was given. And the definition was that sustainable development had to meet the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Again, 9 years later, there was the Conference of the United Nations on Environment and Development, where they also introduced Agenda 21. Maybe some of you may have heard of Agenda 21 already. In 2000 was the UN Millennium Summit, where the Millennium Development Goals were introduced. You have here in this slide a summary of these 8 Millennium Goals. As you can see, they focus on 3 areas: human capital, infrastructure, and human rights. And in this conference, so in 2000, during this conference, 189 countries signed this agreement for the Millennium Development Goals to be achieved by 2015. So they gave themselves this time frame of 15 years to achieve these goals that you see summarized here. Of course, this is a summary. Then if you go and read the documentation related to Millennium Development Goals, you will see that under each of them, there are also specific targets. So it was not just, for example, Millennium Development Goal 1, eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. It was not just this general goal, but there were also specific targets like halving the amount of people dying from hunger, for example, etc. for the other sectors. Then in 2010 was the turn of another conference. This time it was organized in New York. And the aim of this United Nations conference was to evaluate and assess the progress towards reaching the Millennium Development Goals. What came out actually from this conference was that the progress around the world was very uneven. So there were some countries that had made good progress in achieving the Millennium Development Goals, but then there were also countries that were really lagging behind and were not really making good progress. 2 years later, in 2012, there was this conference, Rio Plus 20, called The Future We Want. And among the different documents that came out from this conference were really some declarations dealing with the necessity and the need to develop specific goals to pursue a coherent action on sustainable development. So from there, in 2015 was then the Sustainable Development Summit. And during that summit, the member states of the United Nations adopted the Agenda 2030. Maybe you have heard of Agenda 2030. And part of the Agenda 2030 was also to have the Sustainable Development Goals. So all these countries together committed to achieving these goals to end poverty and fight inequality and tackle climate change by 2030. And as you can see from this summary that you have on this slide, these 17 goals go much more in depth than the Millennium Development Goals. And they try to address the root causes of poverty, and they also highlight the need for development that is coherent and common to all people, no matter what is their social status or their the level of their economic development, for example. So the final aim for Sustainable Development Goals is that no one should be left behind. This is really the final aim of the Sustainable Development Goals. And usually they are presented like this. I assume you may have seen pictures of Sustainable Development Goals already, and usually they are presented in this linear way, like one next to each other. And also when we try to think how food and food sustainability issues are connected to Sustainable Development Goals, we can see that some of them have very specific connections with food and food sustainability. So, for example, SDG number 2, which is to end hunger and all forms of malnutrition by 2030, it can really be linked with food and with access to affordable, nutritious food, and with access to fortified food and vitamin supplements, for example. And in the same way, for example, to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns, which is SDG number 12, it can link very directly with the sustainable use of, for example, arable land and sustainable water management practices, etc. So some SDGs are very openly connected with food. But today I want to present you a bit different type of perspective on this. So let's start with a cake. I guess many of you like cakes. And so let's present the SDGs in this kind of model. So in this sort of wedding cake model. This is a model that was developed by the Stockholm Resilience Center about 2 years ago in 2016. And the key point is that if we organize the different Sustainable Development Goals in this model, we can really understand how, first of all, it's necessary that the biosphere is taken care of. So a stable and resilient planet is then fundamental to support the achievement of the goals that are above it. So goals related to economy, goals related to society, and above all of them, the partnership for all these goals. So the key point here is to understand that it's necessary to reconnect with the biosphere and the needs of the biosphere if we are to move towards a sustainable development. So let's start, for example, from SDG dealing with life in water. What is happening is that there cannot be food security if we continue with the current overexploitation of the oceans. As you can see in this picture, the amount of marine fish capture has increased dramatically, and in some areas there is as much as 90% of overfishing. This, as you can imagine, is a dramatic problem in some areas, and it affects not just the the amount of food, of fish that we can get from the seas, but also, the dynamics in the oceans. So it's a really consistent problem. And also at the same time, the amount of plastic production has increased 20 times over the last 50 years. So basically, if we continue with this scenario and with this kind of patterns, we risk this kind of outcome. We risk a situation where basically we have more plastic than fish in the ocean. And I think if we take a moment to think about it, it is really a bit scary, because the amount of plastic in the ocean, to think that it would be more than fish, I think it's really thought-provoking. Also, another problem related to oceans and the quality of life in water. So this is a map where all the points that are red mark the areas where the levels of the oxygen are really, really low. These are sometimes called ocean dead zones. So areas where the life is pretty much impossible for sea creatures, because the amount of oxygen in the water is really, really low. So again, you can see in the map, these points are marked pretty much all over the world. They are concentrated in some areas, but they're present in all continents. So again, this is another big problem, which is connected also to the amount of food that we can get from these areas. And then if we move to SDG number 15, so life on land. Well, this type of goal is very, very strictly connected with food and food production. In this slide, I have summarized some statistics from different studies, and you can see what is the impact of agriculture on the available agricultural land. So we have that there is 38% of land that is dedicated to agriculture, either as pasture or as cropland. And then if we look at specifically at the impact of livestock, we see that it's really, really consistent, because livestock production covers about 30% of the ice-free land surface of the planet. This happens it can happen in two ways. It can happen as a direct occupation of the land for pasture, or it can happen because we use the land to grow ingredients that are necessary for the animal feeds. So that is another way, which is more like less direct, but still very significant. And for the same reason, if we look at the statistics up there in the right corner here, where there are deforestation causes, we can see that actually meat production and at the same time the production of ingredients for animal feeds is one of the leading causes of deforestation. So this really gives you an idea of how big is the impact of food on land. So we can see that it's necessary to consider the impacts of agriculture also in the context of other species that are living on Earth. So we cannot think that all the land that is there is just for humans and for human consumption needs, but we also have to take into account what other species are there, what other uses are necessary for the land available. And if we move then to other indicators related to other sustainable development goals related to the biosphere, we really understand that we cannot continue with business as usual when it comes to agriculture, because it's gonna affect also resources of clean water. Regarding this, I would like to spend a bit of time talking about the so-called virtual water. So this is maybe something that is not so common to think about, but basically when you consider all the water that is used for the production of food or for the production of other products that you use every day, it could be paper, it could be the clothes you're wearing. So when you consider every step of the production and distribution and consumption of those products, and you calculate how much water is needed for that sort of production, you realize that there are two invisible parts. So if we look at this graph, this 137 liters is the water that we actually use directly every day, and that's the water you use to cook, the water you use to wash yourself, and so on. But then there is this first invisible part, which is related, as I was mentioning, to the things you are using, to the objects you are using. And then the biggest part, the very biggest part here, it's actually related to food. So if you have a diet that includes also meat, this amounts to almost 3,500 liters every day. So that makes 92% of the water that we use every day. Maybe it takes a little bit to understand this. So of course this is water that you don't see directly, but it's the water that it's used in agriculture, for example. It's used to process the food that you're eating and so on. It's used for the distribution and so on. So it's really the biggest share of water we are using, even indirectly, every day is related to food. And this is a very good summary also of how different foods are different when it comes to their water footprint, so their water use. The water footprint is something we will look a bit better into in one of the next lectures, but I wanted to have this here to give you a bit of an overview and to give you some general facts already. So you can see that even all fruits are not the same, all vegetables are not the same, and especially you can see that meat, and especially beef, by far are the type of foods that consume most water. I think this is very interesting and very useful to keep in mind also when thinking about our own personal diet and how that affects the natural resources available. As I said, we will get back to the water footprint more in detail later on, but for now I think this is enough to understand and grasp the concept. So, we really see that if we act on water and land through food and through the way we produce food, then we have really concrete actions on climate change. This is a very fundamental problem. So we have to think of how we produce food, how it affects natural resources, because that is going to have very direct consequences on climate change and its effects. Let's move now to a bit higher up in our so-called wedding cake. And let's try to think about our consumption. So this is the double pyramid. And what we see here in this summary is that those foods that have that should be consumed in larger quantities, like fruits and vegetables, are also those that have a lower impact on the environment. This is something that, again, like we will talk more about later on, but I think it's very clear that there is a pretty much direct link between how much you should eat of something and how impactful that food is on the environment. So foods that you should eat in low quantities, also according to the nutritional recommendations, like meat, for example, it's also foods that have a very significant impact on the environment. So you see on the left side the consumption recommendations, and then on the right side, so on the environmental pyramid, you see their impact. And this is very important to keep in mind, because we can see this very important key point that by reducing meat consumption, we can bring benefits both to our health, so human health, and also to the environment. So this is one key aspect to keep in mind also when looking into goals related to, for example, to health. Let's continue to discuss on about health-related issues. So actually at the moment we have very much problems related with nutrition and all over the world. And these problems come in two very different ways. One is people who are undernourished, and one is people who are obese or at least overweight. As you can see, like the numbers are really, really big, and it's almost like there are almost the same amount of people who suffer from undernourishment are almost the same amount that suffers from obesity or overweight. So in this sense, it's really key to promote those food choices that reduce environmental impact, because they also have positive consequences for human health. So this connects very well, for example, to SDG number 12, which is about promoting a more sustainable consumption. And so sustainable is not just sustainable for the environment, but it can also be sustainable, can also mean to be sustainable from a social perspective. So if people are healthier, then the social sustainability is also bigger. And again, dealing with these problems related to nutrition, this is a phenomenon that is becoming increasingly common, and it's so-called the double burden of nutrition. Double burden means that problems of undernutrition like stunting or micronutrient deficiency happen at the same time with overweight and obesity. And this is interesting because it can happen at the level of society. So in a society we can have both people who are undernourished and then people who are obese, but it can also happen at the individual level. So even an individual can have this problem, this double burden problem. So one person can be overweight or obese and at the same time have micronutrients deficiency. So this is something that it's becoming increasingly common, especially with some developing economies. And it's important to keep in mind in this context because the poverty, so for example, SDG number 1, which is exactly no poverty, is really undermined by the food agenda. So food for health has to go hand in hand with the alleviation of poverty. One thing cannot take place without the other. And at the same time, this connects to other goals. So other goals related to economy and related to society. So there cannot be goals like no poverty and zero hunger if we don't have gender equality and satisfying working conditions. For example, how can we achieve gender equality if there are no policies or other or schooling, for example, that addresses specifically women farmers, because they actually represent the largest share of farmers in the developing countries. So it's really important to develop tools, policies, education that addresses them specifically. So after this overview of every level of this wedding cake, I think it's pretty clear that really all SDGs in one way or the other, some directly, some more indirectly, but they can all be connected to food. And again, I repeat it because I think it's very crucial in this context. It's very important to first take care of the biosphere, so first take care of the natural resources so that we can sustain and we can support the other SDGs and the rest of the layers of this cake. So it's necessary to basically develop a new lens for food and for SDGs. So we have to look forward and we have to look at the way ahead of us with this new lens. And so far there has been actually a lot of focus on productivity. So productivity means how to produce, for example, more food on the same plot of land. So without increasing the extent of that land, but just increasing more food on the same patch of land. So the focus has been very much there so far. But food is not only productivity. So food is also jobs, it's nutrition and culture. So we have to take into account all these aspects. And for this, we need a more comprehensive approach. But of course, we can ask some questions. So for example, can we calculate these impacts in an economic terms? Yes, some calculations actually have been done already. For example, there has been a report by the EU to calculate the impact and so also the impact in economic terms of endocrine disruptors. And then maybe one could wonder that, okay, why would developing or poor countries care about this, or are they caring about this at all? Will they care about this? And actually, yes, things are happening in this direction already. For example, Sri Lanka has already in place a 3-year plan to be toxin-free. So toxin-free Sri Lanka plan, it's already in place, and they have already banned the use of glyphosate. And also, finally, one could ask, why would investors worry about sustainability? But actually what is happening is that investors are already worrying about this, and that the investment in sustainability has grown of 61% in the past 2 years. So here is some key points for the systemic change in the global food system. First of all, I think it's clear from the things that have been presented so far that transformation is needed, and it's needed fast. And actually we can think that we have only about 1 generation to get this done. And then it's necessary to identify who are the keystone actors. So for example, in the sector of business, there are already some businesses that are operating according to the principles of sustainability, but maybe nowadays they are just the 10% of the total. So who are they, and how can they then transfer the knowledge and the tools and everything they've learned to the rest, to the other 90%? This is something that is necessary to do. And also a paradigm shift is necessary in our mentality and in how things are done in society. So the starting point should be that our planet is unnegotiable, and that it's not to be considered as a limit to prosperity. Actually, prosperity can happen also if we take care of the planet and the planet resources. And in the end, another final important point is that food is fundamental to achieve success for people and also for the environment. So here is a bit of an example also of how youth like you, can also contribute in a very concrete way to take action towards the achievement of SDGs. I put here the example of a network that I know directly because I've worked together with them on one project. So it's this SDSN, and this is the youth division of SDSN. It stands for Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and it was launched in 2012 by the UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon. because the idea was to mobilize global scientific and technological expertise to promote practical problem solving for sustainable development. And within this framework, then the idea was to develop also a youth division where young people could be educated about SDGs, and they could be offered the possibility to create pathways to achieve them. And what the other thing that this network does is also to connect young people globally, to exchange ideas, share experiences, and cooperate to achieve SDGs. And finally, it also supports very practically young people to create and also to scale up practical and innovative solutions for SDGs. And I put here some information if you want to join this network. So actually, the membership is free, and it's open to, for example, student associations and other organizations that are focused on youth and the empowerment of youth. And by joining SDSN, you can then take part to, for example, their activities and learn more about their projects and their network. And as you could see, for example, from the previous slide, I put here some examples of their regional offices, but they have regional offices all over the world. But I put these two because they are in South America, so maybe they could be the most interesting for you. And also there is the possibility of volunteering for this network. And you can check out their website. You will find the references in the presentation. So this is one way to get involved. Another thing that they did, which I thought was very useful, and maybe it's something that you can look into if you want to get some ideas, is that this is now the second year that they make this Youth Solutions Report. And in this Youth Solutions Report, what they do is that they gather 50 projects, 50 very concrete projects from all over the world. And here I have reported 2 examples. As you can see, they have a very clear summary, and also for each project they highlight to which SDG they are connected with, or on which SDG they create the most impact on. And it's a very interesting report. I suggest that maybe you look for it online and you take a look, because I think it's gonna give you a lot of ideas about things that maybe you are interested in, and things that maybe you can do also in your community. So I hope that's gonna be interesting for you. I am gonna end the presentation here, but I leave you with some questions that maybe can be useful for you to think about for your own learning, and also maybe to discuss with other students and to discuss in the classroom. And perhaps we can also take some of this when we will meet, at least virtually, online in the coming weeks. So I would like you to think about how you see the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals in your country, and especially how SDGs related to food are implemented in your country. To which extent do you think they are implemented? And I think it's very important also to think of what could be your personal contribution to towards the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals. And for example, think of the business sector. How could the business sector contribute to SDGs, both in your country and also elsewhere? So I hope these questions will be useful to guide your learning, and don't be afraid to reach out to me also by email if you like. Here are my contact details, and I will be happy to answer your questions. Thank you for listening, and see you soon.